Dear students, after studying this module, you shall be able to learn the basic symptoms of schizophrenia, understand the role of genetic factors in the etiology of schizophrenia, learn about the methodology used to study the interaction of genetic and environmental influences including twin and adoption studies, understand the relevance of neurochemical factors and learn about the neurotransmitter based hypothesis in the causation of schizophrenia, learn the different anomalies in the brain structure implicated in the disorder, learn about various prenatal, perinatal and postnatal influences that may lead to the development of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a major disorder affecting all the significant aspects of an individual's behavior. It involves a major breakdown from reality. It is a split into the individual and his world. The cognitive symptoms include delusions, derailment of thought, neologisms, perseveration, clanging of words, thought insertion, external control of thoughts, etc. The affective symptoms include flattening of affect, inappropriateness of emotions and feelings vis-a-vis the environment, apathy, indifference or predominance of some consistently prevailing emotions. The motor behavior is also disturbed, marked by stupor, negativism, mutism, echolalia, echopraxia and vexiflexibility. There is a breakdown of attention and perceptual processes also. They are characterized by hallucinations, perceptual distortions, illusions, breakdown in selective perception, etc. This major clinical disorder is most prevailing across the world. A large number of investigations are carried on to study its causation and the possible treatments. Of all psychological disorders, schizophrenia is perhaps the most complex. Although highly studied, there still is some ambiguity regarding its conceptualization. Many questions about schizophrenia are yet to be answered. The most complicated question is that of causation. Like most other disorders, the causation cannot be pinned down on a single factor. The development of schizophrenia is influenced by various factors like genetic, neurochemical, brain structure, other biological and environmental influences as well as psychological and social factors. There is a complex interplay of genetic and environmental influences. Genetic factors. Schizophrenia, among all the psychological disorders, has the strongest genetic implications. It has been studied extensively. The research on the genetic basis of schizophrenia involves several types of studies including family studies, studies of twins and offspring of twins, adoption studies and linkage and association studies involving molecular genetics. We shall look into some studies of each type to arrive at an overall contribution of genetics to the etiology of schizophrenia. Family studies. Schizophrenia has strong evidence of running in families. The percentage of risk of developing schizophrenia in an individual is greatly associated with the closeness of relatedness to a family member with schizophrenia. That is, the degree of gene sharing determines the risk factor to a large extent. In one major study, family members of more than 1,000 people with schizophrenia were examined. One finding was based on the severity of schizophrenia in the patient. The likelihood that a child will suffer from schizophrenia depended on the severity of the disorder of the close relative. Another interesting finding was that the family member did not inherit the same kind of schizophrenia, say paranoid or catatonic, as the patient. In other words, the family does not inherit a specific but just a general disposition for the disease which may manifest in any of its kind. A review of 40 family and twin studies was carried out by Gottsman. The most important finding was the association between degree of shared gene and the risk factor. For instance, in case of monozygotic twins, 100% gene sharing is there. The chance was shown to be 48% in case of dizygotic twins, where 50% gene sharing is there. It was 17% and the rate dropped as the degree of sharing became lesser. Chance for a child to develop the disorder with both parents having the disease is 46%, and the likelihood of developing the disease in a general population is about 1% only. From the studies, one can see the extent of influence of genetic sharing on the development of schizophrenia, yet monozygotic twins with 100% of gene sharing do not have a 100% chance of developing the disorder. The rate is only 48%. It implies that apart from genes, there are other factors, and we have to take into account these also in the study of the etiology of schizophrenia. Twin studies. Another important factor studied in twin studies is the sharing of environment over and above the genes by being raised together or not. If raised together, identical twins share 100% of their genes as well as 100% of their environment. Grossly speaking, because experiences can never be fully the same even prenatally. And fraternal twins raised together would share 50% of the genes and 100% of their environment. If genes were solely responsible, we would expect identical twins to be fully concordant without an exception, and fraternal twins to both have it 50% of the time. And if the environment is solely responsible, we would expect no difference in concordance rates between identical and fraternal twins. But the findings from years of research suggest that the reality lies in the middle, and that both genes and the environment play their roles, and the interaction between the two is also important. One of the most important famous cases of concordance for schizophrenia is that of Guinean quadruplets. They were studied extensively by Dr. David Rosenthal and colleagues over many years. The 4 of them were monozygotic and were brought up in the same dysfunctional household, and all 4 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Despite this tremendous overlap of genetic disposition and experiences, the sisters differed significantly from one another in terms of manifestation of schizophrenia in them, the time of onset, the symptoms, the severity, the chronicity, the course of the disorder as well as the outcomes. This case brings into account the important matter of unshared environments. Although monozygotic, the 4 sisters would have had different experiences prenatally. The competition for resources and space would have impacted the development of each fetus differently. They evidently differed in terms of their brain development and dysfunctionality, and despite being in the same household, it was found that each sister was appraised differently by the parents owing to the differential social and intellectual deficits. This must have compromised or propelled the development of each sister vis-a-vis the others. Studies on offspring of twins. Studies on offspring of twins provide important implications in the concept of recessive genes in schizophrenia, or the concept of carriers. In one such study, 21 identical twins and 41 fraternal twins and their children were studied. The intention was to find out the likelihood that the child would develop schizophrenia if the parent is non-schizophrenic but whose twins was schizophrenic. The likelihood differed if the parent is schizophrenic but the twin isn't. This can only be explained through the concept of regressive genes. This means that you can have genes that predispose you to the disease but not develop it yourself, and can still pass on the gene to your children. That is, you can be a carrier for schizophrenia. Adoption studies. Adoption study is another way of looking into the role of genetics and environment. The concordance rates are compared for biological and adoptive relatives of an adopted person with schizophrenia who was adopted out of the biological family at an early age. Higher rates for biological relatives would argue for a strong genetic influence, whereas higher rates for adoptive relatives would invariably be an evidence for environmental influences. The children adopted in foster parents are followed up to see if the disorder will occur in them too. Both the approaches to analyze causation with the studies of adoption have indicated strong role of inheritance and genes in this context. The significance of the findings is that despite being raised away from the biological parents, such children have a higher chance of having the disorder themselves. Molecular genetics. To answer the question of how exactly does the genetic influences function or how the disorder is genetically transmitted from a patient to an offspring, researchers have begun to study genes in close proximity, that is, delving into the genetic etiology at a molecular level. The question molecular genetics tries to answer is if there is a single major genetic makeup responsible for schizophrenia. This involves a process called endophenotyping. In the process of identifying the gene or genes responsible for contributing to the specific behavioral and cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. For example, it has been found that smooth pursuit eye movement while tracking a moving object is an ability lacking in patients with schizophrenia and often their relatives. So, this task deficit may be possible endophenotype for schizophrenia, the study of which may give hints into genes responsible for schizophrenia itself. Similarly, endophenotyping involving deficit in performing the task of identifying emotions has also been studied to identify such genes. The research has been very slow owing to the difficulty of the task, and findings have increasingly begun to show that rather than a single schizophrenia gene, schizophrenia involves several genes working together to confer susceptibility to the disorder. Research has been paying attention to several chromosomes including 2, 3, 5, 11, 14, 20 and particularly the 1st, 6th, 8th and the 22nd. It has become apparent that these genes not only play a role in schizophrenia but also in various other psychotic disorders of the schizophrenia spectrum. So, there seems to be a pool of genes that are responsible for the schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Neurochemical factors. Advancements in technology and pharmacology have presented strong evidence for the role of biochemical factors in schizophrenia. The chemical imbalance notion of causation holds that certain alterations in brain chemistry are linked with certain alterations in mental states. This includes hormonal and neurotransmitter systems and changes in their functioning. In the development of schizophrenia, there are two major neurotransmitters related hypotheses, the dopamine and the glutamate hypothesis. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. The basic hypothesis postulates that overactivity of neurotransmitter dopamine is associated with schizophrenic breakdown. It may happen due to the larger than normal number of dopamine containing neurons, inefficiency of the reuptake mechanisms, oversensitivity of the postsynaptic membrane of neurons containing dopamine, lack of enzymes in the synaptic cleft to break down dopamine, etc. The activity of the dopamine neurotransmitter system seems to have a pattern in patients with schizophrenia. The hypothesis was derived from certain observations. A. The drug chlorpromazine, also known as thorazine, and other antiseptic drugs used in treating schizophrenia were found to be very effective. It was then discovered that these drugs have the ability to block dopamine receptors, thereby reducing the level of the neurotransmitter activity. The abuse of amphetamines drugs evokes psychotic symptoms like paranoia and hallucinations, which are very similar to symptoms of schizophrenia. Because of these, substances produce a functional excess of dopamine in the brain. In the treatment of Parkinson's disease, the drug L-Dopa was found to have certain side effects which included psychotic symptoms similar to schizophrenia. Parkinson's disease is caused by low levels of dopamine, and L-Dopa is given to increase the availability of dopamine. When dopamine levels rise, they help motor movements, but as side effects produce symptoms of schizophrenia. When schizophrenia is treated with drugs like chlorpromazine that lower the levels of dopamine, the side effect may manifest as tardive dyskinesia. This is an abnormality in the motor behavior which is similar to the symptom of Parkinson's disease. These observations lead researchers to hypothesize that schizophrenia can be caused due to an excess of dopamine activity. However, the underlying mechanism is still unclear. That is, how exactly dopamine induces psychotic symptoms. One theory is that of aberrant salience. The activity of the dopamine system seems to influence the salience we give to internal and external stimuli. So, high dopamine levels may lead individuals to perceive previously insignificant stimuli as important, and they may try to assign meaning to these stimuli. This might be the basis of hallucinations and delusions in schizophrenia. The high levels of dopamine sustained in the brains of patients with schizophrenia may be due to the following reasons: A. The overproduction or excessive synthesis of dopamine. B. The excessive release of dopamine into the synapse. C. The slow metabolism of dopamine present in the synapses. D. The low levels of reuptake and recycling of dopamine back into the neuron. E. The mimicking by the dopamine receptors. The functional effectiveness of dopamine may be increased if the receptors that dopamine acts on are dense and profuse, or if there is supersensitivity. Later, research indicated that there are actually 5 types of dopamine receptors. Certain receptors seem to have a more definite role in the etiology of schizophrenia. It was found that the efficiency of antipsychotic drugs is related to the ability to block a specific type of dopamine receptors, the D2 receptors. Another finding is that the post-mortem studies with some schizophrenic patients' brains show an excess of D2 receptors. But the question here is that whether the number of D2 receptors more than the normal amount is present even before the patients are administered antipsychotic medication, or is the increase as a result of taking the treatment? The PET scanning technology enables study of the schizophrenic brains of living patients, but the question has not been fully answered. Some studies have reported affirmatively that brains of untreated schizophrenics have significantly higher number of D2 receptors, but this finding has not been replicated in other studies. For several years, the dopamine hypothesis was the most widely accepted biochemical explanation for schizophrenia. The most recent findings show that the relationship between dopamine activity and schizophrenia is not as simple as previously thought. A finding that questions this theory of excessive dopamine in schizophrenic demonstrates the effectiveness of certain drugs which are inefficient in blocking dopamine receptors in the treatment of schizophrenia. An example of such a drug that is weak dopamine antagonistic but an effective treatment for schizophrenia is olanzapine. The hypothesis also fails to account for some other facts. Some patients do not respond to antipsychotic medications that work by blocking dopamine receptors, and that the effect of the drugs takes some time to manifest, while the dopamine blockade begins immediately after administration. Based on such growing evidence, research now points to multiple neurochemical imbalances in simultaneous interaction in the brains of people with schizophrenia. The glutamate hypothesis. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate hypothesis holds that the etiology of schizophrenia is related to lower levels of glutamate in the brain. This hypothesis has come up on the basis of certain observations similar to those that led to the development of the dopamine hypothesis. A. The use of phencyclidine PCP or angle dust blocks the glutamate receptors and the effects produced are similar to the hallucinatory symptoms of schizophrenia. B. Ketamine is an anesthetic which when given intravenously induces psychotic symptoms, and it has been found to lower the level of glutamate in the brain. Just like dopamine, glutamate also has different types of receptors, and the specific type being studied for their role in schizophrenia is the N-methyl-D-aspartame NDMA receptor. Both PCP and ketamine that produce psychotic symptoms are NDMA antagonists. Interestingly, the two hypotheses as discussed above do not challenge each other. The lower levels of glutamate seem to go hand in hand with the dopamine theory. The dopamine system's functioning is also linked with the reducing levels of glutamate. Therefore, higher levels of dopamine go parallel with lower levels of glutamate. Summing up the neurochemical factors causing schizophrenia, the role of dopamine and glutamate is almost established. Studies are now looking into the interplay of more neurochemical elements including serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine and certain neuropeptides in the etiological factors of schizophrenia. Brain structures. Several imaging structures have indicated that certain abnormalities on the brain structures may underlie schizophrenia. It has been observed that people with schizophrenia show certain deficits in task performance and attention. Also, children at risk show certain neurological problems including deficit in attention and abnormal reflexes. Those observations have led researchers to believe that brain damage or dysfunction may cause or accompany schizophrenia. The development of CAT, PET and MRI techniques have enabled researchers to throw light on the structural brain defects in schizophrenia through the study of living patients. Enlargement of ventricles and reduced brain volume. Many studies have shown that ventricles of people with schizophrenia are significantly enlarged than in normal brains. Enlargement of ventricles implies a deficit in brain tissue because given the limited space available, the region surrounding the ventricles composed of brain tissue shrinks, gets atrophied or decreased in its volume. Studies show that it is seen more in men than in women. Studies have shown that the overall brain tissue volume is lower than normal by about 3%. Another important point is that this brain anomaly seems to be present even at early stages of the illness, which suggests that rather than progressive deterioration or degeneration or a consequence of taking medication, this is more of an antecedent nature. But this does not suggest that progressive changes in the brain must be ruled out, and in fact studies have shown reduction in brain volumes over time. However, the phenomena of enlarged ventricles is not a finding exclusive to schizophrenia. It is present only in a minority of schizophrenic brains, and moreover, it is present in patients with other diseases also. Hypofrontality. This refers to the abnormally low activity of the frontal lobes in the schizophrenic brains. When given tasks such as Wisconsin card sorting test that require the activation of the frontal lobe, it has been found that the performance of people with schizophrenia is poor. This dysfunctionality may account for attention or cognitive deficits and some other negative symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Studies have helped deconstruct hypofrontality further by identifying that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, also known as DLPFC, as a specific area of low activity. However, hypofrontality too is not an all-inclusive phenomenon. It is only found in a small percentage of cases. Other areas implicated: the prefrontal cortex, related cortical regions and subcortical circuits including the thalamus and the striatum are implicated in the cognitive deficits. There is emerging evidence that the volume of the thalamus may be relatively lower. Thalamus, being the relay center for sensory information, may break down when flooded with information, which may be the physiological basis. For hallucinations and delusions, the temporal lobes and surrounding medial temporal structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus have also been found to show abnormalities. The amygdala and the hippocampus may have reduced sizes and abnormal chemical and electrical functioning. Just as with enlargement of ventricles and hypofrontality, these anomalies are also not found in all cases of schizophrenia. Prenatal and perinatal and postnatal influences. The term perinatal influence refers to before birth and perinatal means during the process of birth. Postnatal factors are the conditions that affect the child after birth. Several factors in the internal and the external environment can affect the normal development of the fetus, and certain adverse impacts can be correlated to schizophrenia. Some environmental conditions in this context are described below. Exposure to influenza and viral infections. It has been found that prenatal exposure to influenza is likely to cause enlargement of ventricles, which, as we saw earlier, is a brain anomaly often implicated in schizophrenia. A large study was done after a severe influenza epidemic in Finland, and it was found that those whose mothers had been in the second trimester of their pregnancy during the epidemic had a higher chance to have schizophrenia. Also, more people who develop schizophrenia are born in the month of January and March in the North Hemisphere, which might be due to some seasonal virus. The notion that the disorder of schizophrenia is a result of infection, but some viruses were given by Kraepelin. But it is not as simple as he put it, and the effect is rather indirect. Research indicates that viral infections in the mother may cause damage to the brain and hinder normal development of brain in the fetus, resulting in functional anomalies and deficits characteristic of schizophrenia. This may occur if the antibodies produced by the mother's body in reaction to the virus cross the placenta and interfere with the neural development. Rhesus incompatibility. This is a phenomena that occurs when the mother is Rh negative and the fetus is Rs positive. Rhesus is a factor to do with the blood type. The rate of schizophrenia in men who are rhesus negative incompatible with their mother is 2.1% compared to 0.8% in those without the incompatibility. Birth complications. It has been reported that patients with schizophrenia are likely to have been born following a pregnancy or delivery that was complicated in some way. Complications may be in the form of breech delivery, entanglement of the umbilical cord around the baby's neck, prolonged labor, etc., and all these are likely to affect the oxygen supply of the baby. Hypoxia is a perinatal phenomena in which the fetus is deprived of adequate amount of oxygen. The lack of oxygen may cause damage in the brain cells. Malnutrition. Lack of proper nutrient intake by the mother and hence a deficiency in the fetus can also hamper normal brain development. A study on children conceived during the time of Dutch hunger winters showed that they had twice the risk of developing schizophrenia. In conclusion, most of the pre and perinatal influences are associated with improper brain development. The critical period of brain development is the second trimester. During this time, neural migration and interneural connections develop. Therefore, the occurrences of negative influences like infection are most detrimental if present during this period in the pregnancy. Abnormal neural and brain development results in cognitive and other deficits that are hallmarks of schizophrenia. Summary. Schizophrenia is a disorder which split from reality. It includes abnormality in cognitive, affective, attention, perceptual and motor behavior. Schizophrenia is caused due to genetic abnormalities. The dopamine hypothesis holds that schizophrenia is caused due to an excess of dopamine activity in the brain. The glutamate hypothesis holds that schizophrenia is related to lower levels of glutamate in the brain. Enlargement of ventricles and reduced brain volume, structural and functional anomalies in the prefrontal cortex, thalamus, temporal lobes, amygdala and hippocampus are also possible causes of the disorder. Exposure to influenza, viral infections, Rh incompatibility, birth complications and malnutrition can hamper normal brain development leading to schizophrenia.